Listen to me, Isabella. I heard you're living in some disgusting dump. Tomorrow, my son's wealthy in-laws are coming over, and I need someone to clean and cook. I'll throw a few bucks your way if you get over here right now and make yourself useful. Unless, of course, you prefer to starve to death in the dead of night at 2 a.m., exactly a year after you were thrown out like trash and stripped of the factory you spent 15 years building with your own blood, sweat, and tears. The shameless demand from her ex-mother-in-law suddenly echoed through Isabella's phone. A painful humiliation. In order to prepare a lavish christening banquet for the child of her ex-husband's mistress. At this hour of the night, the number of the old woman throwing this tantrum wasn't even saved in her contacts. Who did this woman think she was? Instead of getting angry, Isabella let out a cold, chilling laugh. Those who had kicked the lawful wife out into the middle of a freezing winter night could never have imagined that the old tailor's scissors in her hands would completely sever their source of income. This is a deeply satisfying story about karma, where a cruel mother-in-law and a cheating husband fall into absolute ruin overnight, desperately begging at the feet of the woman they once discarded. If you are curious about this thrilling tale of revenge, hit that subscribe button and leave a thumbs up right now. The clock turns back exactly 1 year to a drafty, dilapidated factory on the south side of Chicago during a bitter winter night, with the lake-effect wind penetrating straight to the bone. In that moment, Isabella was desperately working on paper patterns through the night, barely noticing that blood was seeping from the tips of her freezing, cracked fingers. The factory floor, with the heating deliberately turned off in the middle of a brutal Midwest winter, felt like a block of ice. The freezing wind that forced its way through the cracks in the concrete walls was so sharp it felt like it was slicing her skin. Despite wearing layers of sweatpants and an old work jacket covered in white fabric dust and chalk, it wasn't enough to fend off the bone-chilling cold. Isabella was curled up on a cold, backless plastic chair. The sight of her painstakingly drawing lines on a massive sheet of patterned paper with stiff, trembling fingers was heartbreaking. If this order isn't ready by tomorrow morning, we'll lose the client. Please. Just turn the heat on a little, she pleaded, a puff of white breath escaping her dry, chapped lips. But the response she received was cruel. Heating costs money. Stop being dramatic and work faster. Her ex-husband, Alex, was sitting comfortably next to a glowing red electric space heater, glaring at her. The joints of Isabella's stiff fingers were swollen and red. Even holding a pen was incredibly difficult. The blue tailor's chalk dust, accumulated over 15 years, which wouldn't wash off even with aggressive scrubbing, was embedded under her fingernails, making the weight of those years feel like literal torture. Finally, the tip of her freezing, calloused finger cracked, and a drop of thick red blood fell onto the pristine white pattern paper. The stain spreading pitifully across the paper was as tragic as her life of suffering. "My joints are frozen. I can't bend them the way I need to," she murmured, her voice vanishing into the icy air. Suddenly, the heavy, rusted iron doors of the factory were shoved open. The deafening sound of metal scraping against rusty tracks shook the entire building, accompanied by a razor-sharp gust of wind. The heavy, sweet scent of a luxury designer perfume enveloped the factory floor, almost suffocating in its intensity. Victoria, the mistress, strutted in wearing a lavish mink coat. Alex, who had been guarding the heater, sprang up like lightning and wrapped his arms around her shoulders with deep affection. "My love, you're here. Why did you bother coming to such a dusty place? Come here, get warm." His voice was so sickly sweet and tender, it was hard to believe it belonged to the same man who had just been snapping and yelling. This scene was a drastic contrast to Isabella's pathetic state, bleeding and dressed in worn-out, grease-stained work clothes. Victoria, draped in a coat worth tens of thousands of dollars, carried an air of sky-high arrogance. Right behind them strutted Margaret, Isabella's mother-in-law, exaggerating her movements as she gently stroked Victoria's slightly protruding belly. The display was so shameless and repulsive, it would make anyone sick to their stomach. "Oh, my precious grandson might catch a cold in this drafty air. Bring that heater over here quickly," Margaret demanded. Shortly after, her sharp, hateful gaze landed on Isabella, who was trying to warm her frozen hands. "We don't need this useless, insolent woman in my house anymore. Pack your things and get out." That cruel sentence acted like a jagged saw, tearing mercilessly at Isabella's heart. A bitter memory from 10 years ago when Margaret forced her to sit at a sewing machine in the dead of winter to finish an order, causing her to collapse from exhaustion and miscarry her first child shattered like glass and pierced deep into her chest. Her most precious hope had been destroyed by their endless greed, yet these were people without a single ounce of guilt. Isabella stared at the blood-stained pattern papers scattered across the floor. She had served them for 15 years, working until she felt her bones turning to dust. She had started in a tiny, rented sewing room with a deposit of barely $3,000. Her youth had evaporated while she acted as a tireless workhorse for Alex's subcontracting factory, eating nothing but cold leftovers. The remorse for the pathetic years she spent treated like a machine, and the guilt toward the child who passed away without ever seeing the world, flooded her heart. The strength in her legs suddenly gave out under the weight of the injustice that hit her like a tsunami. She collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. The sob bubbling up inside her reached her throat, but she bit her lip and swallowed it so no one would hear. Her jaw trembled slightly, as if it might shatter. It was completely absurd to be thrown out like garbage in the middle of a freezing night, banished from the very factory she had built with her own blood, sweat, and tears. At that moment, a thick stack of documents was callously thrown at Isabella's feet. Papers detailing a preliminary property settlement and the surrender of copyright for all her designs slid across the cold concrete, filling her vision. It was a unilateral eviction notice from the arrogant and shameless Alex. Isabella slowly lowered her head and, one by one, gathered the papers scattered on the icy floor. Amid the cold radiating up from her knees, her trembling shoulders slowly tensed. The feeling of injustice after being ruthlessly trampled was slowly forging into a sharp, cold reason, like the blade of a knife. When she finally raised her head, there was no trace of sorrow in her red eyes. "You want me to leave empty-handed? Fine. If that's what you want, I will." With nails stained with chalk and blood, she gripped the corner of the stiff legal document, almost crushing it. An explosive anger, urging her to flip the table and spit in their shameless faces, boiled inside her, but Isabella slowly suppressed it deep into the pit of her stomach. The corner of her mouth curled up into a calm yet terrifying smile. In her mind, the countdown to a very specific date had already begun. Isabella knew better than anyone that with only the old patterns left in the factory, they would never pass the rigorous design renewal audit imposed by the massive American-style conglomerate, ASC, that kept them in business. Her gaze, cold as ice, wasn't focused on this petty argument, but on the day of their total destruction. Exactly 1 year from now, the day of their economic death sentence, when the factory's machines, possessing only outdated designs, would stop forever. The air in the old, freezing factory felt even colder. Isabella, without saying a word, turned her hunched back and walked heavily toward her battered metal locker in the corner of the hall. Before her hand could even reach the handle, Margaret brutally threw a large black trash bag at her. The plastic bag hit the ground, dragging across the dusty concrete, and smacked against the toes of Isabella's worn-out work boots. "Don't even think about touching anything that doesn't belong to you. Try to take one single item from this factory's inventory, and you'll see what happens," Margaret yelled, crossing her arms and raising her chin with utmost contempt. "The spools of thread and fabric you've been sneaking out all this time would be enough to fill a truck. Grab your rags, you beggar, and get out of here before I call the cops and have you arrested for theft." Accusing the lawful wife who had worked relentlessly for 15 years to make her husband's factory the #1 subcontractor in the industry of being a thief was truly pathetic. But Isabella didn't open her mouth to respond to Margaret's shameless insults. Sincere explanations never work on people blinded by greed. Isabella ignored the trash bag at her feet, opened the rusty, heavy locker door, and reached into the very back. Carefully arranged inside were all sorts of pattern-making tools that had passed through her rough, calloused hands over the past 15 years. However, Isabella left behind all the expensive, imported drafting tools and valuable items. She only carefully pulled out a pair of old, heavy metal tailor's scissors. These scissors, with their black paint chipping off and smelling of iron, were a keepsake from her late mother, who had spent her life altering and sewing clothes at the Maxwell Street flea market. As soon as the touch of the cold metal charged with her mother's tears and fingerprints brushed against her palm, the deep sorrow she had buried at the bottom of her heart hit her like a wave. "This is my mother's keepsake. It's my only treasure. I'll take this and nothing else," Isabella said, her voice completely devoid of emotion, as she shoved the scissors deep into her coat pocket. This time, Alex violently threw a brown envelope onto the table. "Don't try to get pity by crying. Just sign this share forfeiture document. If you don't expect to walk out those doors tonight." Alex approached menacingly with a mocking smile, forcing a cheap plastic pen between her rough, bloody fingers. Victoria, clinging to him like a leech, affectionately pressed against his arm, radiating the suffocating scent of her perfume. Oh, honey, look at her. She's shaking so much she can't even hold a pen. Just have her put down her social security number and let's get this over with. Victoria snorted in disgust, looking up and down at Isabella's ruined coat, then laughed cynically. I'm hungry. The baby is kicking. Let's finish this quickly and go get a prime ribeye steak with truffle butter. In such a tragic moment, as a wife who had sacrificed her entire life was being thrown onto the street in the freezing night, they were talking about fine dining. This was the true face of shameless human beings who had completely abandoned their conscience. Isabella, enduring Victoria's silent, mocking glare, placed the pen on the table. Without the slightest resistance, she gripped it with her stiff fingers, pressing the tip into the paper until it almost tore. She scrawled her signature and wrote her SSN on the bottom margin. In the brief moment the black ink was immortalized on paper, the cold and composed Isabella calculated a date in her heart, 365 days. Exactly 1 year. It was vividly etched into her mind. She was determined to carve into their very bones the price of enduring this filthy humiliation. Done. Now I'll just take my data from my personal computer and leave, Isabella said. As she turned toward the dusty desktop computer in the corner, Alex's relaxed face instantly soured. Why are you touching the computer? You're not planning to steal the client address book or our factory's important contacts, are you? Panicking, he brutally blocked Isabella's path, snatching the mouse from the desk and hiding it behind his back. Because he had spent his whole life stabbing others in the back and stealing what was theirs, he assumed everyone else would do the same. A shallow, pathetic suspicion. Don't touch anything. I'll watch you with my own eyes. Type in your password and get out of my factory, he demanded. Seeing her ex-husband's pathetic behavior, desperately shielding the monitor with his body, Isabella couldn't even muster a bitter smile. There wasn't a single piece of valuable information on that piece of junk he cherished so much. She violently ripped off a yellow sticky note on the desk, scribbled 6 familiar digits, and slapped it right in the middle of the screen. The password is your birthday, Alex. If you're so paranoid, log in right now and see for yourself. While Alex frantically mashed the keyboard and opened folders on the desktop, Isabella boldly unplugged the cable of her personal external hard drive, which had been discreetly connected to the back of the PC. A sharp scraping sound of metal pins echoed as the plug was pulled. The old monitor flickered for a second, indicating the data connection was severed. What are you doing? Put that on the table right now, Alex yelled, eyes wide. Isabella slipped the palm-sized hard drive into the deepest pocket of her thin coat and replied with icy detachment. I've already uploaded all the data for the old patterns we'll use until next spring onto the company's shared server. Absolutely nothing is missing. Isabella, seeing right through Alex's stupidity, pronounced every word with razor-sharp precision. But what is on this drive are the new designs for the upcoming seasons. They came exclusively from my brain and my exhausted fingers. It's my personal property, and as the director, you should know perfectly well that legally, this falls outside the scope of the rights transfer. Alex glanced at the hundreds of folders lined up on the monitor and laughed cynically. For an incompetent man who couldn't even distinguish the subtle curves of a pattern or track the seasonal trends of major brands, the sheer number of visible files was enough to make him feel secure. Take it or don't. Do whatever you want. Do you think our factory will stop running just because you take a piece of scrap metal? Alex arrogantly tapped the monitor and sneered. Looking at these files on the server, it looks like we'll survive comfortably for 3 years. Your business here is done. Get out of my factory forever. The foolish boasting of a man who didn't realize what he had just done. The perfect trap of destruction he had just walked into of his own free will. He had no idea that it wasn't the number of files that mattered, but the fact that the only core technology capable of meeting the ASC's rigorous upcoming standards had completely vanished. Isabella coldly tightened her lips, feeling the hard shapes of the old scissors and the hard drive in her pocket. She adjusted the collar of her thin coat and walked silently toward the iron doors of the factory, the place where she had poured out her blood and sweat for 15 years. Behind her, she could hear Victoria's cynical laughter as she picked out a meat menu for tomorrow's lunch, overlapping with Margaret's loud, obnoxious chatter. But their primitive noise no longer reached her ears. She hadn't deleted anything, nor had she stolen a thing. It all belonged to her from the very beginning. She had simply put an end to her foolish charity, giving away her precious technology for free to people who didn't deserve it. As soon as Isabella stepped out, the heavy iron doors slammed shut behind her with a massive crash, as if they couldn't hold their own weight. Hundreds of pounds of iron sliding on rusted tracks hit the frame, making a terrifying sound that shook the industrial park. It was the sound of a heavy, irreversible farewell, perfectly separating the biting cold outside from the filthy greed inside. The freezing night wind hit her face mercilessly. Yet a hot, burning fire of revenge blazed in Isabella's heart. The lethal trap that would deliver a perfect economic death sentence on the day of the corporate design renewal next year had been set. The countdown to ruin set to explode in exactly 365 days had begun without a single margin of error. When the factory doors closed, Isabella's heavy footsteps finally stopped at the end of a narrow, deserted street in Chicago's Rogers Park neighborhood. She turned a rusted key in the padlock of a tiny, $800 a month basement apartment. The rusted hinge screeched as if it couldn't bear the weight. As soon as the door opened, the smell of dampness and the sour stench of black mold on the walls hit her nose. The chill of the yellow linoleum floor, where the radiator had long been broken, seeped through the thin soles of her boots and mercilessly froze her toes. She stood dazed in the middle of the freezing room, looking around the empty space. There was only a ceiling with mold spreading like a map and walls with peeling wallpaper. It was a pathetic scene, the sad receipt for sacrificing 15 years of her youth until her bones broke. "So this is the payoff for my youth," she whispered. With freezing hands, she slowly unzipped her old duffel bag. She didn't pull out anything expensive, just the heavy metal tailor's scissors her mother had left her. The rough texture of the faded fabric wrapped around the handle was the first thing her fingertips felt, followed by the weight of the cold metal. The deep sorrow she had suppressed finally exploded like a broken dam. "Mom, I lived like a dog for 15 years, slaving away for Alex's family. But the only thing I have left are your old scissors." Isabella hugged the cold scissors tightly and sat curled up on the icy floor, pulling her knees to her chest so no one would hear. With tightly pressed lips, she finally let out hoarse sobs, as if her insides were being torn apart. The sound of her muffled crying mixed tragically with the howling of the wind slipping through the window cracks. "You said I was obsolete, worthless goods, right?" she thought, her ex-husband's and mother-in-law's grinning faces flashing in her mind. "Enjoy it while you can. In a year, I will make you crawl and lick the dust off the floor in front of your new daughter-in-law's prestigious family." But her tears didn't last all night. After a short, intense cry, Isabella stood up unsteadily and walked to the cramped old bathroom. She turned the faucet, and freezing water poured out. She splashed her face roughly, washing away the redness, the swelling, and the traces of her tears without a trace. "No more crying. Mourning my fate ends tonight." Drying her face with a stiff towel, Isabella stood before the cracked bathroom mirror. Behind the drops of cold water clinging to the glass, her sharp, resentful gaze locked in with determination. The prominent outline of her cheekbones and her swollen eyelids were proof of her terrifying resolve. The daughter-in-law of some nobody. The nameless seamstress of Alex's factory. "That pathetic skin washes down the drain tonight," she whispered in a voice as cold as ice. "Isabella Newman, the best fashion pattern engineer in the country. Under my real name, I will completely cut off your lifeblood." Stepping away from the mirror, she sat right on the cold floor, opened her old laptop, and turned it on. In the thick darkness, the pale light of the monitor illuminated her face. Thirsty for revenge, her fingertips, cracked from Taylor's chalk, furiously struck the keyboard. Files from her unique portfolio designs that had easily passed the strict selections of massive corporations in the past lined up on the screen. Hundreds of complex patterns born from her exhausted fingers over 15 years shone brightly. Without this flawless new template technology for the ASC's major fashion brand launch next year, those outdated machines in Alex's factory wouldn't survive a single day. When she finished working, Isabella pulled an old wallet from her coat pocket. She carefully retrieved a business card with the direct phone number of the CEO of the American-style conglomerate, ASC, which he had personally handed to her during a factory visit 3 years ago, praising her to the heavens. She lightly stroked the texture of the gold-edged luxury card with her calloused finger. "Mr. CEO, you once praised my skills, saying they were worth millions. Now I will show you who the true owner of this technology is." Her eyes were fixed on the absolute reversal of power that would happen exactly 1 year from now. The next morning, right at 9 a.m. as the business day officially began, Isabella finally dialed the CEO's direct line. A long, heavy ringtone broke the silence, followed by a soft electronic click. "Good morning, Mr. CEO. This is Isabella Newman, the Naira maker who worked at Alex Collins's facility. There was a moment of silence on the other end, followed by the CEO's deep, surprised voice. Isabella Newman. Ah, the artist who created all those incredible patterns under Mr. Collins. To what do I owe this call so early, miss? Newman? Without a second of hesitation, Isabella got straight to the point, her voice low and cold. As of today, I have completely severed ties with that subcontracting factory. In exchange, I want to offer you exclusive rights to my new patterns, which will guarantee the absolute success of the ASC's collection renewal next year. As the tension on the other end of the line thickened, Isabella delivered the final blow. In return, I want you to grant me a certain level of authority. The position of Chief Director of Quality Control and Production, with the absolute right to inspect and eliminate partner companies with my own hands next year. The massive, perfect trap designed to sever the livelihoods of those who had betrayed their family ties had finally taken its sharpest form. Exactly 1 year later, during a sweltering Chicago summer, the factory Isabella had been thrown out of was boiling like hell. A rusted ceiling fan spun sluggishly, its bent blades scraping against the guard, making an irritating metallic noise. But it was useless against the suffocating heat that exceeded 95 degrees. Alex, sitting in the director's office completely unaware that the perfect time bomb Isabella planted was about to detonate, pulled out the latest smartphone. The sight of him engrossed in a phone call with a luxury sports car dealer was truly pathetic. Yes, excuse me. My beautiful wife just got a craving for this car, so please have that premium sports model ready by tomorrow morning. Yes, payment will be made with our corporate credit card. Max it out if you have to. While he was arrogantly bragging, a sharp, deafening machine alarm rang out across the entire factory, and the main assembly line jerked to a halt. The sour smell of a burned-out, overloaded motor spread through the sticky air. The shift manager, drenched in cold, sweat, and pale as a ghost, burst into the office. In his trembling hands, he held an official product rejection document from the ASC headquarters, bearing an authoritative signature. Behind him, through the window, thousands of garments from the fall collection rejected and treated like trash by corporate could be seen piling up like a mountain in the factory courtyard. The blazing summer sun beat down on the torn plastic packaging, and the smell of damp synthetic fibers wafted sickeningly through the hot air. Sir! Corporate just rejected our entire fall production run because the patterns are fundamentally flawed. They returned everything. Our factory is going to go bankrupt. We'll end up on the streets. The manager's voice shook violently, but Alex, still holding his phone, just waved his hand in annoyance. Ugh, the machines just broke down for a second. Why are you making such a fuss? Mr. Dealer, please ignore that. Let's proceed with the contract. He completely ignored the desperate warning, crumpled up the breach of contract penalty notice worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and threw it on the floor. The stiff papers scattered uselessly. But the numbers written on every page represented a massive debt enough to sink his company permanently. The workers, terrified their wages would be cut, stopped working and began whispering. But Alex's foolish bragging only grew louder after he hung up. We'll cover the penalty by taking out a max loan from the bank. My father-in-law is a top-tier supplier for the conglomerate. What are you all so afraid of? Oblivious to the fact that his company's life was ending, he was still squandering precious company funds to buy the favor of his new wife. At the same time, Alex's mother, Margaret, was busy clearing the shelves of the most expensive items at a local specialty deli, constantly wiping sweat from her face. Determined not to lose face in front of Victoria's wealthy family from the North Shore, she carried a basket full of prime ribeye steak and fresh seafood. Oh, even if Victoria's family is filthy rich, they can't match my devotion. I'll rub my incredible cooking skills right in their arrogant faces. Sweating profusely, Margaret bragged to the neighborhood locals, desperately trying to prepare a christening banquet to host her new daughter-in-law's family. However, her cramped old kitchen had long ago turned into a pigsty with nowhere to step. Thick cuts of meat lay on the cutting board, improperly drained, and the sharp smell of raw blood hung in the air. On the greasy gas stove, a pot lid bounced from the steam, and dark brown broth boiled over, hissing and smoking on the burner. Ugh, why isn't the blood draining from this meat? Whatever, I'll just drown it in expensive spices. What do they know? Margaret's hands holding the dull knife were clumsy, the kitchen echoing with the loud hacking of the blade against a plastic cutting board. It was already 2 a.m., and the heat from the large burner made the kitchen feel like a sauna. The high-quality ingredients, left at room temperature for too long in the heat, began to emit a sour, nauseating smell of rot. When Margaret finally tasted the beef roast, which already smelled off, her face went pale and she nearly collapsed. What do I do now? Everything is ruined. Those picky snobs are coming at noon tomorrow. What am I going to do with this garbage? With blurry vision, Margaret frustratedly swiped the grease-stained screen of her smartphone and frantically searched her contacts. She found the number of her former daughter-in-law, Isabella Newman, the woman she had thrown onto the street like an old shoe. Ordering the lawful wife to cook a banquet for the mistress's child was an idea only a mind blinded by greed could concoct. Where is that venomous woman, Isabella? I'll call that useless tramp right now and make her prep the food for tomorrow. These foolish people had absolutely no idea that the perfect time bomb tightening around their necks was already ticking and about to explode. At 2 a.m., when everything was shrouded in silence, a loud vibration rang out in the living room of a luxury Gold Coast penthouse, with the dazzling night lights of the Chicago skyline spread out below. An exceptionally tacky, out-of-place ringtone violently ripped through the elegant, quiet room, which smelled faintly of an expensive diffuser. On the vibrating screen resting on the marble table, the name Margaret flashed in red, a name that hadn't been deleted for over a decade. Seeing that repulsive name, a cold, sharp smile slowly formed on Isabella's red lips. The certainty that the time had come for these monsters to dig their own graves made her eyes flash intensely. They finally realize the noose is tightening, and they're starting to thrash. Without the slightest rush, Isabella leaned deep into the plush leather sofa, her silk slip dress rustling softly against her skin, and calmly pressed the answer button. Margaret's shrill scream exploded from the speaker, almost bursting her eardrums. Listen to me. You need to get to my house right now. Tomorrow at noon. My son's new in-laws are arriving. Get over here fast and prepare a luxury christening banquet. It was truly disgusting to see her petty ex-mother-in-law still believing her authority held any weight, the same woman who had kicked her out into the freezing night a year ago. Isabella coldly suppressed her rising disgust and decided to silently enjoy watching this stupid old woman dig her own grave. Margaret couldn't even hide her rapid breathing over the phone. She was so desperate to trample Isabella's pride using her new in-laws' wealth. Do you even know how unimaginably rich my in-laws are? These are people from Winnetka who will walk in with briefcases full of cash. Money you'll never see in your entire life, even if you sew until your fingers fall off. The empty boasts of someone who didn't even know that all the corporate orders keeping them afloat had just been canceled. Isabella didn't let this hollow threat affect her emotions in the slightest. She lightly, elegantly swirled a crystal glass of wine in her hand. The intense burgundy, red as a sunset, slid gracefully down the glass as Isabella maintained total silence, not uttering a single syllable. She let the heavy, icy silence like a deadly poison seep through the line. Seeing that her former daughter-in-law, who used to tremble and yield to her anger, wasn't reacting, a thick panic crept into Margaret's voice. Unable to contain her boiling rage, she started screaming louder, shrieking into the phone as if possessed. Hey, Isabella Newman, are you listening to me? I'll text you the address, and you better crawl over here with your apron on in 30 minutes. Her hoarse voice, breaking from screaming, and her heavy panting pounded against Isabella's ears. Having enjoyed this pathetic tantrum enough, Isabella finally set her wine glass on the table and drew the sword of her revenge. The base of the crystal glass hit the marble, leaving a crisp echo. Before the sound faded, her lips slowly parted. I'm listening. A christening banquet at this hour of the night? The number of the old woman making this scene isn't in my contacts. Who are you exactly? That single sentence held overwhelming power, completely shattering the disgusting chains of family that had bound her for 15 years, treating them like absolute strangers. As soon as Isabella's cold, firm voice sliced through the air, only a strange gasping sound came from the other end. When Margaret, stunned speechless by the unexpected humiliation and mockery, couldn't say a word, Isabella pulled the trigger on her final ultimatum. It wasn't just a warning. It was a cruel, sadistic timer meant to cut off her enemy's lifeblood with absolute precision. Since you have time to spout nonsense, open your ears and listen carefully. Tomorrow morning, at exactly 9 a.m., the financial audit team from the headquarters of the American-style conglomerate will be paying a visit to your son's factory. As if mocking Margaret's frozen silence, Isabella laced every syllable with venom, driving a dagger into her opponent's heart. Instead of figuring out how to exploit someone else's daughter, Tell your son to clean up the garbage around him before he ends up bankrupt on the street tomorrow morning. Giving her opponent absolutely no chance to defend herself or beg for mercy, Isabella ruthlessly pressed the red end call button. The cold, mechanical dial tone filled her spacious living room, proving she had flawlessly won this war. At the exact same time, in Margaret's narrow kitchen, where the sickening smell of rotting food lingered, a tragedy was unfolding. The smartphone slipped from Margaret's shocked hands, hitting the hard tile floor and shattering into pieces. The shards of glass reflected the harsh fluorescent light, as if signaling the tragic future of her family, which was also about to be smashed to pieces. Margaret collapsed into a chair, her face deathly pale. She muttered into the void with wide eyes, unable to believe it. Financial audit team? What did that woman just say? Now, the only thing they had to face was inevitable ruin and the terrifying abyss of poverty brought upon them by the great disaster named Isabella Newman. At 9 a.m., in the desolate courtyard of the subcontracting factory, the constant hum of sewing machines had completely died down. A massive shift had occurred due to the tens of thousands of rejected garments returned the previous night. A sleek, black luxury SUV, worth over $100,000, rolled quietly onto the dry, dusty lot. The sound of expensive tires crushing gravel broke the tense silence. A personal assistant, impeccably dressed in a suit, quickly stepped out of the driver's seat and respectfully opened the rear door. Out stepped a woman whose mere presence dominated the surroundings. It was Isabella, wearing perfectly tailored white and gold haute couture that fit her flawlessly from head to toe. The woman standing there was a completely different person from the one covered in chalk dust and oil stains a year ago. The sharp tips of her stilettos, intricately crafted from the finest leather, began to strike the cracked marble floor of the factory lobby in regular, piercing intervals. The sharp clicking sound weighed heavily on the entire building. It sounded like the footsteps of a judge coming to execute ignorant sinners. Stepping inside, Isabella frowned in disgust at the smell of rancid industrial oil and sour sweat that hit her nose. I sacrificed my bones and body for 15 years to build this place. But even after a year, this disgusting stench still makes me sick. The tragic memory of being thrown out like trash in the freezing winter flashed through her mind, but a dazzling, arrogant smile appeared on her lips. At that moment, Alex's hair disheveled and looking haggard after a sleepless night dealing with a mountain of defective fall merchandise ran out of the director's office. Assuming an important guest from corporate had arrived, he rushed over with a flattering smile, but his steps froze like stone when he saw Isabella standing in the middle of the lobby. His ex-wife, once neglected and unattractive, whom he had tossed into the gutter, had returned as a flawless, radiant powerhouse he could barely look in the eye. Alex's cloudy eyes shook violently, trying to deny reality, but Isabella's overwhelming charisma already had him by the throat. You, what are you doing here at this hour? Who do you think you are, just walking in here? The same petty, classless arrogance from a year ago. He still believed he was above her. In response to his senseless yelling, Isabella didn't get angry. She slowly looked Alex up and down with a haughty gaze, as if observing an insect crawling on the floor. The smell of cold sweat on his wrinkled shirt and the dirt under his fingernails from scratching his head all night were evident. But Isabella didn't change her expression one bit. She didn't even feel the need to open her mouth to answer. She merely nodded her chin. The personal assistant standing next to her stepped forward, pulled a thick, gold-edged business card from his jacket, and firmly slapped it right in front of Alex's eyes. Alex's jaw dropped like an idiot when he saw the gold-engraved logo of the massive fashion conglomerate gleaming in the morning sun. The assistant looked at Alex with disgust and broke the silence with a clear, categorical warning. You cannot speak to her in that manner. She is no longer the woman from your past. She is here as the chief auditor, with full executive authority from corporate headquarters. I suggest you show some respect immediately. As soon as the title Chief Auditor hit Alex's eardrums, Isabella shoved a folder containing an officially sealed corporate document right into his chest. The sharp edge of the stiff paper scratched his sweaty shirt, and a painful shame he had never felt in his entire life pierced his body. As of today, we are initiating a financial audit and a special inspection of all partner facilities, Isabella ordered, her tone icy and authoritative. Stop wasting my breath. Open the accounting books right now. On her command, 7 elite accountants who had followed her in placed their heavy briefcases on the table. The metal locks snapped open simultaneously, the sharp sounds echoing in the lobby before Alex could even close his mouth. Dozens of audit reports and stiff legal notices were pulled out, covering the table without leaving a single gap. There's no time to stand there looking stupid. Pull the files, starting with the inspection of the defective goods returned yesterday, all the way to the expense reports for the funds you blew at nightclubs, Isabella demanded. Among the dozens of factory workers holding their breath at this unbelievable scene, whispers of disbelief erupted like an avalanche. Isn't that the director's ex-wife? Holy crap! After getting thrown out, how did she come back as a corporate boss? They say the boss had an affair and kicked her out with nothing. Looks like she came back with a sword to cut his head off. Our factory is done for. Dozens of sharp glares and brazen whispers pierced Alex like daggers. Wanting nothing more than to sink into the floor and hide in a mouse hole, he flushed red and then pale, constantly clearing his throat. It was the moment his dignity was utterly obliterated in front of the employees he had exploited his whole life, and in front of his ex-wife. Izzy, what is the meaning of this? How could you show up here as the head of corporate? Alex, finally realizing the gravity of the situation, reached out a sweaty hand to grab Isabella's sleeve with a pathetic, fawning smile. First of all, there are too many eyes here. Let's talk privately in my office. After all, we aren't strangers. We were married for over 10 years. We don't have to be so cold. Isabella took a step back as if avoiding filthy garbage and violently swatted his dirty hand away. In her eyes, there was no trace of her former blind devotion, nor any marital affection. There was only a sharp hatred, a desire to mercilessly and thoroughly crush her enemy. How dare you touch me with your filthy hands? Isabella sneered. We'll save the private conversations for when you're in handcuffs. You can talk all you want to the prosecutor. She coldly checked the luxury watch on her wrist and started the countdown to end his life. Bring me the evidence justifying the first phase of your embezzled funds. By 6 p.m. at the latest. Do not omit a single detail about the lease payments for that luxury imported sports car you bought for your mistress yesterday. The secret he desperately wanted to hide was exposed in front of all his employees. Alex's lips trembled in terror. Izzy, I'm begging you, save me just this once. If I have to pay this penalty, I'll really go bankrupt. You must have some feelings left for this factory, right? Feelings? That single word slicing from Isabella's lips cut the air sharper than a razor. When you threw me out onto the street in the dead of winter without a dime, me, who slaved away day and night for 15 years, did you talk about feelings then? Isabella raised her chin and smiled like an absolute conqueror, shattering the last remnants of Alex's pride into dust. Don't even dream of defending yourself. You will deliver 100% of the original documents by noon tomorrow. Our lawyers have already prepared a petition for the IRS. You're facing prison time for tax fraud. Shortly before 6 p.m., the designated deadline, Alex hurriedly approached the factory courtyard, which felt like a sauna without AC. Drenched in sticky sweat from head to toe, he didn't even have the courage to look into Isabella's piercing eyes. His pathetic expression, constantly licking his dry lips, was enough to make anyone sick. A thin, battered folder of supposed justifications shook violently in his hands. Listen, Izzy, I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. I didn't embezzle company money for private use at all. The man who had kicked his lawful wife out to the curb was now trying to defend himself. It was laughable. All this money. I was forced to spend it on client meetings and operational costs for the sake of our factory. You know the condition of this place. To this petty, disgusting excuse, Isabella didn't even feel the need to open her mouth. With a decisive movement, she snatched the thick stack of payment statements from the accountant's hands. Without a second of hesitation, she threw the forged report Alex had spent all night manipulating into the air. The stiff, laminated copies of receipts fluttered like a blizzard, landing mercilessly at Alex's feet. The sound of paper hitting the hot asphalt broke the heavy silence. Your mouth might twist with lies, but tell the truth. Stop defending yourself with that filthy mouth. These papers scattered here speak for themselves. Isabella stepped on a credit card statement lying on the ground with the sharp point of her luxury heel, completely dismantling his pathetic defense line. A private suite at Northwestern Memorial for your mistress's postpartum care. $20,000. A down payment for a luxury sports car yesterday afternoon. $40,000. What does this have to do with factory operations? The monstrous truth was out. Hundreds of thousands of dollars that Alex claimed were representation costs had been spent on luxuries and satisfying his mistress's vanity. Hearing this shocking revelation, Whispers of uncontrollable anger erupted like a volcano among the dozens of factory workers watching in silence. Are you kidding me? He hasn't paid us in 3 months, and he's spending company money on his mistress's hospital suites and luxury cars? We're sweating like pigs in this heat with one fan, and our boss is spoiling his girlfriend with a corporate card. We need to call the cops. Hateful accusations from the subordinates he had always exploited rained down on him from all sides. Finally, Alex's legs gave out. He stumbled backward until he collapsed onto a metal chair. The legs of the chair scraped against the rough cement floor, making a screeching sound that grated on the nerves. Alex's face went pale, and his cloudy eyes were filled with overwhelming terror. Izzy. Madam Director, please save me just this once. If this massive penalty hits me, I'll really end up ruined on the street. Remember, we were married for 10 years. At this disgusting, shameless begging, Isabella looked at him with the same cruelty one reserves for a crushed insect. She hadn't forgotten for a single day the cruel words that came from that filthy mouth the night she was thrown out empty-handed. Isabella announced corporate's final, brutal decision in a mechanical, sharp tone devoid of any emotion. The final decision from headquarters. As of today, all cooperation agreements with the American-style conglomerate are permanently canceled. All outbound clothing shipments from this warehouse are completely halted immediately. Alex's lips trembled violently, but Isabella's merciless blockade wasn't over yet. And one more piece of news, the one you fear the most. All payments for goods already shipped are completely suspended. That means you won't see another dime. Hearing this perfect death sentence fall upon him without mercy, Alex grabbed his head with both hands and started gasping for air. Then, Isabella cruelly severed the last lifeline he was holding on to. Oh, and the credit line and corporate advances you so happily squandered have just been completely frozen by our finance department. Isabella smiled widely as the absolute victor, announcing the death of the funding source that maintained his mother's and mistress's lavish lifestyles. From this moment on, the corporate money tap is shut off. You won't even be able to buy a sandwich with our money. The true horror that the card, the sole source of Alex's wealth and the pillar of his family, was completely cut off cast a dark shadow over the entire factory. When Alex began crawling on the floor, crying and sniffling disgustingly, trying to grab the hem of Isabella's pants, she kicked his dirty hand away with absolute coldness. In front of dozens of watching employees, the man once called the director was crawling on the concrete floor, lying flat to beg at the feet of his ex-wife. She skipped any unnecessary explanations or emotional arguments and drove the final nail into her opponent's coffin with one sentence. Lawsuits for fraud and embezzlement will be filed first thing tomorrow morning. The DA's office will preemptively seize your accounts. I will completely cut off your life and your company's life. Isabella treated the man lying on the ground like repulsive trash and left the factory with confident strides, not looking back. The sharp, regular sound of her stilettos hitting the marble floor echoed through the empty lobby like a funeral march, perfectly heralding Alex's ruin. In the pocket of Alex's pants, as he was left alone, his phone started vibrating frantically. Notifications for overdue payday loan installments and the rejection of his sports car lease rang out one after another. Alex, completely sinking into the swamp of despair called bankruptcy, clenched his fists and let out a horrifying scream until his throat was raw. Isabella Newman! You venomous snake! You think I'm just going to sit back and take this? But this rebellion was just the frustrated scream of a defeated man, a useless cry that melted away behind the heavy iron doors of the factory, now completely shut. At the exact same time, Isabella was executing her tense revenge at the factory, completely cutting off Alex's funding. Victoria's family was sitting arrogantly in the places of honor in the old living room of Alex's house, celebrating the christening. Margaret was wearing a high-quality red silk suit, and a massive fake diamond ring sparkled on her wrinkled fingers to boost her ego in front of the in-laws. She had tried hard to secretly throw away the spoiled food from the kitchen. Ultimately, she set out pre-made food from a cheap deli she bought at the crack of dawn, acting shamelessly as if it were a luxury banquet she had cooked all night. However, the disgusting smell of hard, greasy croquettes and dry, rubbery meatloaf ruined the party's atmosphere. Victoria's mother looked on with suspicion and disgust, poking at her cheap plastic plate with the tip of her fork. Margaret, her back drenched in cold sweat from fear of being discovered, hastily began to weave exaggerated lies. "Oh, madam, this is wild boar stew and prime beef I simmered all night using our family's secret recipe. Please, don't ask. Just eat to your heart's content." Margaret waved her hand with the fake diamond in the air scandalously, showing off her son's non-existent wealth. "My son Alex runs the fashion business for the corporate holding with an iron fist. The money flows like a river. His wealth would be enough to throw 100 parties like this. This cheap, petty arrogance, desperate not to lose status in front of the wealthy family, hung heavily in the murky air of the living room. As the in-laws hesitantly turned their silverware, looking at each other in embarrassment, the doorbell rang, shattering the silence. The annoying noise instantly killed the mood. Margaret, though internally irritated, forced a smile for her in-laws and acted as if nothing was wrong. "Oh, who lacks the manners to ring the bell so early? Alex probably ordered some expensive wine to treat his esteemed guests." Margaret enthusiastically walked to the front door and opened it. Instead of a delivery boy with a luxury gift, a mail carrier stood there with a neutral expression. In his hand, he held a thick, ominous envelope sent via certified mail. "Margaret Collins? I have a very important notice from the county court. Please sign here on the screen." As soon as the terrifying word "court" echoed in the doorway, and the seal of a government institution appeared on the envelope, Margaret's wrinkled fingers began to tremble. Feeling the sharp gaze of the in-laws sitting in the living room, she tried to ignore the cold sweat running down her back. Not knowing what was inside, she opened the thick paper envelope with shaking hands. The sound of tearing paper echoed ominously in the quiet hallway. When she pulled out the stiff document to check its contents, Margaret, who had been so proud moments ago, stopped breathing. In the center of the document, printed in bold ink redder than blood, was a terrifying sentence: "Notice of foreclosure and property seizure." Foreclosure? What kind of nonsense is this? Who would auction off a house belonging to someone like me? Below it was a warning whose severity even Margaret, who had never dealt with courts in her life, understood. A notice of imminent seizure and appraisal. The terrible truth was coming out. Her son Alex, unable to bear the massive corporate penalties and the costs of his mistress's lavish life, had secretly taken out a mortgage, using the house under his mother's name as collateral. The despair of realizing that her only shelter, which she had protected for decades, would change owners overnight, caused Margaret's mind to go completely blank. My precious house is going to be seized. If my son is the director of a successful company, why is the house that costs so much going to be auctioned off for debts? Hearing Margaret's heartbreaking scream from the hallway, the face of Victoria's father, which had been somewhat friendly until now, turned to ice in an instant. Red with fury, he threw his heavy silver cutlery onto the greasy table and stood up from his chair. The silverware hit the edge of the empty porcelain plate, making it wobble. Along with that unpleasant sound, a look of disgust and contempt, as if looking at street trash, locked onto Margaret's face. "Are you trying to scam and play games with our family? It turns out our daughter, whom we raised with such love, is living in the house of a debtor that's going into foreclosure. You're going to end up bankrupt on the street tomorrow." The celebratory meal, meant to show off wealth to the rich in-laws, turned into an inescapable abyss of shame and terror in less than a minute. Margaret's pride, which had soared so high, was now completely destroyed. The woman could only tremble with lips as pale as paper. The dignity of her magnificent family, which she had so cruelly flaunted in front of Isabella, was crushed by a single piece of paper. Perfect karma. Margaret's voice shook like a leaf in the wind. "No, sir, it's not like that. The court must have made a mistake. As soon as Alex gets here, he'll explain everything. It's just a misunderstanding." Just as the desperate Margaret tried to grab Victoria's father's pant leg, spewing pathetic excuses in a trembling voice, a heavy, ominous phone vibration came from his pocket. Victoria's father was breathing heavily, furious, and already preparing to leave. In Margaret's ears, drowning in the well of ruin, the sound was terrifying, a sign of another disaster about to strip away whatever was left of their lives. The incessant vibration finally pulled the trigger on their terrifying destruction. The once kind face of Victoria's father, his large heavy body sprang up from the table, and his heavy wooden chair pushed back, scratching the marble floor sharply. The screeching sound of wooden legs gave everyone sitting goosebumps. What does that mean? The American-style conglomerate permanently terminated their contract with Alex's factory and declared total bankruptcy? The news of the fatal bankruptcy coming through the phone caused the jaws of Victoria's family, who had been sitting like royalty in the living room, to drop. All payments have been frozen? On top of a massive breach of contract penalty, so they're closing the company tomorrow morning? After confirming the worst, unbelievable news, Victoria's father looked down at Margaret, who was sitting on the floor with bloodshot eyes. Unable to contain his boiling rage, he let out a deafening roar that shook the entire living room. "You family of scammers! You're worse than trash. How dare you deceive my precious daughter when you're nothing but a bunch of insolvent debtors who are going to be thrown out on the street tomorrow?" Hearing these terrible insults from the wealthy in-law she had idolized so much, Margaret lost the strength in her legs and fell face first onto the cold floor. The knees of her silk suit, which she had bragged about so much, wrinkled pitifully as she crawled on the floor, along with the fingers wearing the fake diamond. Victoria, fully grasping the severity of the situation, also stood up with a deathly pale face and brutally yanked the engagement ring off her finger. "No wonder you never gave me a certificate of authenticity. You said this was a diamond worth tens of thousands. But it turns out it's just a cheap cubic zirconia from a flea market." The fake ring Victoria threw in frustration rolled across the hard marble floor, making a loud, vulgar sound. The pathetic echo of the bouncing fake stone clearly proved how shallow the foundations of this family built on vanity really were. The ring hit a table leg, slid to the side, and stopped in a greasy corner of the living room. "How dare you prey on our family's money with a cheap zirconia ring? Mom, I don't want to breathe in here for another minute. Grab the baby, we're packing our things." Victoria's family brutally snatched the baby sleeping in the master bedroom and headed for the entrance without a shred of regret. "Don't even think about ever showing your disgusting faces in front of my daughter and grandson again. From this moment on, all financial support and ties between your family of beggars and ours are severed." Victoria's father kicked the door, throwing merciless curses. The heavy door slammed against the frame with a massive bang that shook the entire house. Along with that cruel sound, the massive financial backing of the in-laws, which had been the Collins family's only lifeline, was completely cut. In the empty living room, swept through by the hurricane of the in-laws, only the smell of cheap food and suffocating, rotting meat remained. On the ruined banquet table, the food cooled disgustingly, and spilled broth slowly dripped from the tablecloth onto the floor. Right into the middle of these pathetic ruins walked Alex, stumbling. He looked completely destroyed after Isabella had thoroughly trampled him at the factory. Drenched in sweat and dirt, Alex looked at the ruined table and his mother crying on the floor, and finally lost all control. His eyes, clouded by shock, didn't look at his mother with concern. They only shot hatred and curses. "This is all because of your petty greed, Mother. Why did you have to kick Isabella out onto the street in the middle of winter? The factory was doing great, and you brought this disaster upon us." It was a despicable rebellion. He had completely forgotten his own financial embezzlement and infidelity, shifting all the blame onto his old mother. A pathetic scene showing humanity at its absolute lowest. Margaret, losing her mind after hearing her son's ungrateful words, with eyes bloodshot from rage, began mercilessly pounding her fists against Alex's back. "You ungrateful bastard! Damn you! You're the one who secretly stole the deed to my house and mortgaged it to the bank. You turned the mother who sacrificed so much for you into a homeless beggar in her old age. In that house, hot as an oven because the AC was turned off to save money, a disgusting physical fight broke out between mother and son. They were disheveled, covered in sticky sweat and dirty tears. Seeing them pull each other's hair, tear at each other's clothes, and roll around on the living room floor in madness. It was the end of creatures lower than animals, blinded by greed, who had hit rock bottom and begun to devour each other. Only the dirty screams of those who had reached the bottom, blaming each other, filled the space. Then, the screen of Alex's smartphone lying on the floor flashed coldly, displaying a new notification. The brutal movements of both of them momentarily stopped. On the screen of the phone Alex picked up with trembling hands was a message with a final warning from a debt collector. Final pre-litigation notice. Due to gross indebtedness, a levy has been placed on all bank accounts, resulting in an immediate freeze. The property is scheduled for public auction. It was an unavoidable death sentence. It meant they would soon lose the roof over their heads, and without access to bank accounts, they would fall into absolute poverty overnight. Reading the merciless summons, Alex looked at the ruined banquet table, his face covered in bleeding scratches from his mother, and began to laugh emptily like a madman. In the cloudy eyes of a man who finally realized his world had shattered into a million pieces, there was only deep despair and terror at the thought that no defense would work here. It's over. My money, my car, my house, my company. Now I've lost everything. Everything. I've really become a bum. That night was a night of total destruction, where the cruelty with which they had treated Isabella, treating her like a worthless object, returned to them 1,000 times stronger, cutting off their heads. The crisp air of the Chicago autumn seemed unnoticeable because the interior of the massive McCormick Place Expo Center, where a major fashion show was taking place, was boiling with zeal and enthusiasm that seemed ready to explode at any moment. Hundreds of press camera flashes went off continuously, illuminating the runway like a waterfall of light. Today, the American-style conglomerate is recording its highest profits since inception. We are honored to introduce the hero behind these innovative designs that have completely changed the map of this industry. In front of thousands of VIP guests holding their breath to listen, the confident voice of the presenter echoed from incredibly expensive speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, the Chief Designer and Director of Quality Control from corporate headquarters, Miss Isabella Newman. It was then that her real name, which for 15 long, dark years had just been the name of a nameless seamstress in a hostile subcontracting factory, rang out on the most prestigious stage in the country. Isabella, wearing her perfectly tailored white and gold suit, began to walk with confident, elegant strides to the center of the stage. The beautiful sound of her stilettos rhythmically hitting the floor sounded like the triumphant march of a victor who had risen from the ruins, trampling over all the terrible wounds of her past. Amidst the deafening standing ovation of thousands of spectators, Isabella smiled in a relaxed, dazzling manner. She was no longer someone's incompetent wife or an oppressed daughter-in-law. She was the picture of a flawless powerhouse, standing at the peak of a massive empire, relying solely on her skills forged through hard work. Thank you. The clothes you are praising today are the truest result of 15 years of scars, poured from my calloused fingers. As Isabella basked in the flash of glory, the scenery shifted drastically to show a massive, old and gloomy logistics center on the outskirts of Joliet, Illinois. In sharp contrast to the dazzling stage of the fashion show, the suffocating smell of sour sweat and a thick cloud of gray dust filled the place. A giant exhaust fan that looked like a piece of junk spun endlessly, emitting a metallic sound that tore at the eardrums. But it wasn't enough to clear the stale air from the stuffy warehouse. Hey, you over there! Move it! Move it! If you keep crawling on the floor like worms and don't finish today's shipments, don't even dream of getting a dime for today's shift. The loud yell of the shift manager echoed widely. The shoulders of Alex and Margaret, who had sunk into poverty, crushed by mounting fines and garnishments, trembled. Two people who once played the roles of an established director and an arrogant mother-in-law were now pitifully dragging their feet across the floor. They wore the reflective vests of temporary workers, drenched in sweat. On their hands, which once wore silk bought with Isabella's blood and sweat for 15 years, rested only cheap cottonwork gloves. Alex, carrying a 50-pound box of clothing heavier than himself, grimaced in pain from the sweat stinging his eyes and dropped the heavy load like a sack of potatoes. My back! I was a director. I drove a luxury sports car. Why do I have to haul boxes in this dust in this hellhole? Next to him, Margaret, who was pushing boxes with her cheap gloves, also pounded her fist against her, hunched, aching back, shedding tears, and wiping her runny nose. They, who had lived in luxury their whole lives drinking Isabella's blood, had fallen to rock bottom, trapped in the chains of hard manual labor, the same labor they used to order others to do. At that moment, Isabella, who had arrived at the logistics center for an inspection, approached the panting Alex and his mother to the sharp clicking of her stilettos. Seeing the arrival of the chief auditor from corporate, dressed in an elegant haute couture suit, the warehouse workers bowed and made way for her. At the sound of those familiar footsteps, Alex and Margaret raised their deathly pale faces. The eyes of Alex, lying on the dusty floor, shook violently at the sight of Isabella. However, she didn't even look at their wretched appearance. Instead of throwing superficial, emotional taunts and bringing up past wounds, she simply audited them with absolute perfection, using the coldest and most objective corporate language. Your break ended 10 minutes ago. Warehouse staff are not to idle. Get back to the assembly line immediately and lift those boxes. Hearing that sharp, dry voice, Alex and Margaret trembled and, crawling, tried to beg passionately. But Isabella's gaze was fixed solely on the employee roster she held in her hand. Temporary workers Alex and Margaret Collins. You are behind on your quota today. You are required to work mandatory overtime until midnight. The bitter reality for the culprits was that their former glorious names and titles had been completely erased. Now, they were referred to merely as the lowest-tier employee numbers. What's more, Isabella's merciless legal warning drove the final nail into their coffin. Oh, and your wages will be garnished up to the maximum legal limit to cover your court-ordered debts. You know perfectly well that even if you sweat blood-hauling boxes all night, not a single dollar will make it into your pockets. Hearing this perfect sentence, which forced them to pay for their sins with interest, Alex and Margaret abandoned all their dignity and pride, falling onto the rough concrete floor and weeping bitterly. Isabella, trampling the terrifying screams of the desperate losers with complete indifference, turned around and slowly began walking away, taking full control of the massive warehouse. Her confident steps weren't heading into the stuffy cloud of dust, but toward the grand exit, where the bright autumn sun poured in like a cascade of light. As Isabella pushed open the doors of the dark warehouse and stepped into the light, a heavy monologue symbolizing the complete breaking of her 15-year chains echoed behind her beautiful, radiant back. This isn't some childish revenge. It's simply me, finally reclaiming my real name and my rightful position, the one you stole and shamelessly enjoyed. Behind her, the massive iron doors of the warehouse slowly descended, sealing the line of light away from the darkness. The heavy vibration of the thick iron plate hitting the floor sent a tremor through the ground. The true life of the woman named Isabella Newman had finally begun a new, perfect, and glorious chapter. For 15 long, dark years, Isabella had to live like a shadow in front of an old sewing machine, forgetting her own name. Those arrogant people, who had cruelly exploited her blood and sweat in the name of family, never imagined that the old scissors they threw onto the street would completely and irrevocably cut down their shameless pride. The punishment Isabella inflicted upon them was not superficial revenge, but the just, perfect payoff for their own greed, which they had sown themselves. Dear viewers, how did you enjoy today's satisfying story of justice served by Isabella? Outside the window, a warm spring breeze is blowing, and on every branch that survived the long winter, beautiful flower buds are miraculously blooming. I believe that our twisting, turning lives are not much different from the laws of nature hidden in the calluses of our fingertips. To all of you who have lived sacrificing yourselves selflessly as someone's wife, daughter-in-law, or mother, within you hides a fragrance more precious and beautiful than the most expensive jewels in the world. It is precisely because we survived a long, harsh winter, curling up to protect our families, that we can be reborn as strong, classy individuals. Just like now. Today, stepping beyond unconditional devotion to others, we wholeheartedly encourage you to step out into this bright world and proudly speak your own beautiful names. If today's story of Isabella brought comfort to your heavy hearts, before you close this video, please hit that red subscribe button and leave a thumbs up. If you have friends around you who are hurting because they served others their whole lives like Isabella and need some comfort, we would be incredibly grateful if you shared this video with them through your messenger apps. A warm, supportive comment and clicking the share button is the greatest strength for the many Isabellases out there in the world, helping them shed their old shells and start a new spring in their lives. Like a warm spring, we fold our hands and pray that the rest of your lives, dear viewers, will always be filled with bright and warm days. That's all for this classy drama about a life story overflowing with wisdom that elevates your dignity. Thank you very much.